Occurring within the scope of the much larger Beaumont/Port Arthur campaign, the massively important, albeit very small, strategically significant town of Vidor was now in the process of seeing its local defending forces being completely eradicated by the PLAN Marine forces being committed to this combat operation, as the once battalion-sized force of 750 total defending armed reactionary civilian militia personnel had now been whittled down by 8 a.m. to a force no larger than a company, as there were only 130 defenders remaining, as many of their element had been completely and totally fixed in place near the line of contact established by the three PLAN Marine Recon Combat Companies of the 6th Marine Brigade's Recon Battalion, and had thus been heavily shelled by batteries within the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's Artillery Battalion, as their 122 millimeter PLZ-07 howitzers pounded the area, eliminating over half of the battalion-sized force, and also thousands of non-combatants with them in that local area, as by now, as many of the original force had fled the area just before the massive artillery bombardment, as the withering fire already being laid down by the PLAN Marine Recon forces was enough to drive many of the defenders away, who had either fled to the north or northwest further into the town. The remaining defenders fleeing directly north would be intercepted by the company of the PLAN Marine Brigade's Medium Combined Arms Battalion, carrying out the southern wing of their attack into the town, which was the Light Tank/Assault Gun Company, as they likewise would methodically and thoroughly eradicate all resistance in the area as they hit the retreating armed reactionary civilian militia forces on their flanks, as they had exposed flanks as they retreated. The company carrying out the assault to their north was one of the two committed heavy amphibious marine infantry companies, as the company in the center of the attack, one of the two committed heavy marine amphibious infantry companies, would be they who would actually assault the area containing the headquarters of the militia forces, which essentially more or less was a family farm owned by one of the leaders in the leadership cadre that had been converted into a sort of ad hoc base, as they had created a large earthen berm around a metal building, which they used as their headquarters building as well as their logistical stockpile, as there was also a large fuel tank that was right behind this building, and they even had created a firing range near the barn on the property out of sandbags, where they had placed targets, which would end up being used as a fighting position as the PLAN Marines would be assaulting the property, as the sandbags would stand, of course, extremely minimal chances of survival against the heavy firepower of the ZBD-05 infantry fighting vehicles with their extremely powerful 30mm autocannons, their 12.7mm turret-mounted heavy machine guns, and even the shorter range but still destructive HJ-73C ATGMs, which were mounted on a rail on the side of the turrets of these vehicles. As the vehicles moved into place, pushing through the east of the town, moving westward, the assault on the town itself was a uniform assault, as in all three companies moved together at the same time, regardless of whether they received heavy resistance or not, as the far northernmost company was a mile outside of the town limits. The middle company straddled the northernmost end of town and just outside of town limits itself, as the area being described is the general north-northwest portion of the small town of Vidor. The remaining defenders, now broken up into much smaller groups due to the chaos, pandemonium, and confusion on the battlefield, also lacking communications equipment due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare jamming, these forces now effectively had no form of command and control, as the 30-man strong force which sat on the headquarters property were the only forces that had immediate communications with one another, as they were essentially clustered together in a single grouping, while elsewhere throughout this portion of the town and just outside of it, many other small groups were trying to make their way out to retreat from the area. And again, the responsibility of the northernmost PLAN Marine Heavy Amphibious Infantry Company that was outside of the town to the north would be to catch any stragglers that somehow made it outside of the town and proceeded further north, although none of the surviving elements would do so, as many would be completely eradicated by the attack being carried out in the center of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion strike to the west. As we go to the map of the area being described, the last roughly 130 defenders of the local militia forces were essentially within this 1.5 by 1 mile area, as it was 1.5 miles east-west by 1 mile north-south. Although there, besides this grouping of approximately 85 personnel in this area, was one other cut-off grouping in another part of the town at the local big box store, as in this area, which would be assaulted later, there would be 46 defenders in the area around the big box store, which would be cleared by the attacking forces after this particular area had initially been cleared between 8 and 9:30 a.m., or within 1.5 hours' time. As the PLAN forces were by now fully well aware that the armed reactionary militia civilian forces were deploying weapons such as very primitive anti-vehicle weapons such as Molotovs, they were somewhat hesitant, at least in this particular area, to send out their vehicles first, even along with infantry, and thus opted instead to deploy their infantry squads of each platoon out and ahead of the vehicles to clear the area very thoroughly in order to allow for the vehicles to rapidly move behind them, as the area would be fully cleared out by PLAN Marine Infantry. The vehicles could then quickly move in behind them instead of taking their time if they moved ahead or with the infantry alongside of them, as this was the choice of the company captain, as he could have assaulted this area in any of the aforementioned manners. He chose to utilize his infantry dismounts, which in a sense was still a very wise decision, considering that this area was full of swamps and wetlands, as it was on the outer edges of the north of town, as well as also homes and storm shelters and other terrain features from which those that were well enough hidden could quickly come out to attack vehicles, regardless of the fact that the coalition had the area on lockdown, had an iron grip over the whole area in terms of ISR capabilities. There were still ways within which that well-hidden forces could conduct very rapid surprise attacks, and therefore the company captain, having had heard about what had occurred to the south, with one vehicle able to be effectively Molotoved and another attempt on another vehicle which failed, he opted instead to deploy again his infantry out and ahead of the vehicles, as in this case, only one platoon would move forward with their vehicles and only a short distance, as they would do this to provide protection for their squads, which they would drop off immediately upon crossing a tributary and onto the farm property, which served as the headquarters for the militia forces of the area of Vidor. As we go to the map of the local area, there, in this area, was a building material and sand supply company. There was also other small businesses, including a gas station as well. There was a farm across the road from the militia headquarters farm, which again had a very high earthen berm constructed around a metal building, which contained the militia's logistics, as it was their central logistical dump, which everyone in the militia had contributed to over time. And there was a fuel tank as well for fuel, which could be put into smaller gas tanks, such as hand-carried gas tanks, and carried to vehicles operated by the militia, such as their technicals. And this area would be promptly struck by an airstrike ahead of the advance of the infantry Marines operating in this area of this heavy Marine amphibious infantry company. As preliminary, heavy firepower would be laid down against the militia headquarters area by two platoons firing into the area. A small grouping of 3 personnel, having had moved off property and into a thickly wooded area by some wetlands in the tributary, would attempt to lay down fire against these vehicles, including with a Barrett 50 cal, which would do nothing to the front of these vehicles whatsoever at all, and were promptly responded to with 30mm autocannon fire with HE armor-piercing ammunition, which shredded them into pieces, throwing body parts every which way. As that had occurred, there had been a small grouping of defenders of the leadership cadre, which were also inside of the portable building, which promptly was struck by a airstrike of 2 1,000-pound precision-guided laser munitions, which not only blew the building and the gas tank into multiple pieces and threw them in multiple directions, but also blew out the protective berm around the structure. As that had occurred, a grouping of 10 had been trying to flee into the area. Some were wiped out by the massive explosion from the airstrike, and others by 30mm autocannon fire, which was ISR directed, as quadcopter assets were running circuits throughout the battlefield, mapping it in real time. Everybody could be seen, especially those out in the open, although some that were better hidden would be discovered later. Initially, anyone moving and out in the open and not sitting still in small groupings protected by the thick wooded canopies of the forested areas or the swamps, or inside of buildings, especially underground structures such as the storm cellars, which some had already been seen running into as they fled other areas and went from building to building and stayed on the move. These would be targeted by the assets of the PLAAF, and they would have been targeted by the Russian VVS assets, which effectively consisted of the Su-34 strike aircraft squadron, although at this time the remaining Su-34s that still had munitions were being utilized in other areas, although the J-10s, some of which still contained their pair of laser-guided precision munitions, 1,000-pounders, were utilized extensively in this particular operation. As the artillery would also be called upon, as the artillery was busy with multiple different areas across this large battle space, which was the entirety of the Beaumont/Port Arthur campaign battle space. There would still be artillery fire missions diverted through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, targeting different forces in this battle space. There were also the 82mm mortars operated by the Mortar Company, which was the built-in fire support company of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, which could also be called upon for fire support or called upon just to do strikes if certain forces were seen in certain areas within range. As the operation was underway, 2 specially trained drone operators in the headquarters platoon just off this map had fired 2 HE warhead-equipped CH-901A single-tube versions of these loitering munitions, and had set them abruptly on AI target-seeking mode, which would be heavily influenced by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which calculated all of the ISR footage and other data into its decision-making on which targets to strike. As these would loiter the battlefield for a short time, looking for targets of opportunity, they would surely find plenty. As now, the heavy firepower being levied on these forces on the farm, blasting the barn to complete and total pieces, along with the 5 personnel inside, were moving forward, taking some fire from a few survivors that were still in the prone position, but as they got closer, they continually laid down 30mm autocannon and 12.7mm fire, shredding the few survivors of this group to absolute and total pieces. As they moved into the now destroyed sandbagged area and barn area, and these personnel, having had fled, the storm shelter had been, the concrete storm cellar shelter, had been mowed down by a combination of 30mm autocannon fire that was ISR directed and the airstrike. These forces, as they had taken fire as they moved forward, crossing this tributary, dropped off their squads to check the area. As that happened, these personnel that had taken a small amount of fire had returned fire and destroyed this grouping in this wooded area. As that was occurring, the operations unfolding throughout the battlefield were numerous, and covering them all in a rational, coherent order is extremely difficult, but it will be attempted as so many different things were occurring at near or about the same time. As a grouping had fled from the safety of this storm shelter and moved into this home, they would eventually be cleared by PLAN Marine Infantry stack teams as the squads moved about the area. As the forces, having had fled north from other parts of the battlefield, ended up in this wooded and swampy area that was partially swamps, they would take up positions along this creek and other areas in the woods to make attempts to ambush the attacking forces, and would in short order be horribly mauled for it. As these 2 squads from this platoon had bounded and covered forward as they had received contact from these personnel in the woods, they dropped into the prone position and promptly returned fire against the hidden forces of the militiamen hiding in the woods that had levied fire upon them. As now this was occurring, the fire being returned was simply massive, as PLAN Marine Infantry not only responded with their own small arms, they also utilized heavier weapons such as the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades with anti-personnel ammunition, as well as also an HJ-08 ATGM that was man-portable being carried on one of the Marines, and also 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath the barrels of the Marines which carried these weapons, as they would fire these at the personnel taking cover in the woods. The devastation would be complete, as many of those that were taking position behind trees and other earthen formations in this wooded area would perish in a relatively short firefight, as the supporting fire would also come from their own vehicles and would be fired over the heads of the troops now in the prone position as they cautiously bounded and covered forward, eventually wiping out these personnel with not only their own small arms and heavier weapons like their rocket-propelled grenades and ATGMs and 35mm tube-fired grenades, but again, they had vehicle-based support that was being called upon when it was safe to do so, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system calculated the angle and traverse of all weapons to essentially ensure that there was no more friendly fire incidents, which were almost cut down to zero coalition-wide, as in across all of the coalition forces, with very minimal occurrences, as most of the occurrences would essentially be due to the negligence of the forces involved, as many of those were third-rate militaries that signed on to be part of the coalition. As the fighting in this area was excessively heavy, both on the farm property that was now being secured by the bounding and covering squads of PLAN Marine Infantry forces, as this squad took position in a wedge to watch these directions to give covering fire if need be to this squad, checking the now blown out, bermed in area, and this squad moving up to guard the flanks, as they also had their vehicles to assist them if need be in a tactical L vector of fire. These two squads, after this squad checked to ensure that the storm shelter was empty, which was a concrete storm cellar, they then bounded and covered with this other squad to check this house where they would temporarily take position, as these two squads from this platoon had bounded and covered towards their targets as they tried to close with the enemy within grenade range vis-a-vis the defending forces. These squads would clear buildings on this side of this road, on the far northern edge of Vidor. These were suburban / quasi-rural homes. These squads would do the same, checking these buildings in this area, as this platoon in the far south of the attack, moving into the area, would be promptly attacked as this squad moved to the entry point of this storm cellar by two personnel inside that tried to return fire with small arms, but a hand grenade would be thrown in, and it would annihilate these two personnel, as this squad checked the shed and then took position temporarily around it. This squad and this squad would then bound and cover into the home, while this squad took position to the south of the home on the outside to effectively lay down supporting fire if need be for the personnel conducting the clearance operations inside the home as they broke into stack teams and checked the upper and lower floors of the house, as it was a two-floor home, as the rest of the troops outside took up position in either wedge formations or in line formations, depending on the layout of the area, to aid the forces inside doing the clearance operations, as they could both either be called in if assistance was needed in the situation of clearing a building, or they could watch the entry and exit points for those trying to escape the building in terms of defending forces, or they could defend the area from attackers coming from elsewhere, as the standard operating procedure for building clearance involves either troops and or vehicles sitting outside a building being cleared for these purposes, as this was a tactical masterstroke of an operation now unfolding. The PLAN Marines were doing exceptionally well in clearing this particular area of suburban / quasi-rural housing, as they moved through the area methodically with their forces and cleared these buildings. They would proceed all the way to their end point on the far western end of this particular segment of the area to be cleared, as now these two squads would somewhat split further apart in wedge formations and continue to bound and cover. This grouping of 12 personnel, since this map opened up as these forces were engaging these personnel, and these were starting to prepare to clear these buildings, with one squad here outside as the squad breached, and this squad outside to watch the entry and exit points of the home, and these personnel were eliminating these personnel, and this squad could have rendered assistance if need be, but they were mostly fixated on the entry and exit points and the home across the yard here. This squad clearing the home was supported by this squad watching the garage area and the front door for anyone trying to escape, and they then moved ahead, and this squad would likewise bound ahead as well with this to support this squad clearing this home in the same way they supported them when they cleared out this home. When this squad went in to clear this home, the way they supported them here, they would move here to do the same thing as this squad would leave and begin to clear this home, and would end up taking fire out of some of the windows and returning fire as the squad would lay down fire, supporting fire while the squad would breach the home. This squad would do the same as they moved along the street, as they also were in a wedge formation, as this squad cleared this home from this platoon, and this squad then moved around to watch this area in a wedge formation to give this squad inside support clearing the building. This squad would enter through the garage and also assist in clearing the home. For the two squads to move out of the home, one would take up position along the side of this home, and the other that helped clear this home would clear this home, with this squad moving alongside of it to aid in security in the same way as this wooded area to the south. There had been no movement seen in the area, and thus there was no enemy activity suspected, and therefore as this squad cleared this building, they would exit, clear the pool house, and then move around with this squad around the pool area and take up position, while this other squad that had helped clear this house from this platoon would move in to clear this house, with this squad also joining them as they were starting to take fire from the 8 personnel that had earlier fled into this building. As they laid down fire, they had bounded and covered tactically to clear this home. As this squad had moved out first, they laid down fire while this squad moved in, and then they too moved in as the clearance procedures were already beginning inside of that home against the 8 present total defending personnel. As all of that was occurring in the south of the map, and the airstrike had occurred against the headquarters, along with the heavy assault being carried out by the massive firepower of the 2 northern platoons of the attack, laying down 30mm autocannon fire, 12.7mm fire to support the operations against the headquarters area. As these personnel had taken position temporarily in the home, this squad would cross this creek through this thickly wooded forested area, as these personnel had long since crossed and had been seen moving through the wooded area, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had essentially made all the calculations for where it most likely anticipated these forces to be based on their trajectory of movement, and thus 122mm strikes were eventually called in that pounded this area with multiple shells from one of the firing batteries of the artillery battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, firing their PLZ-07 howitzers. As other forces were already moving throughout the map at this time, a grouping coming out of this wetland area, this heavily wooded swamp, had decided this was a poor way in which to travel, and thus tried to take their chances moving elsewhere as they had tried to get their bearings. As they moved through this area and left the relative protection of the woodlands, as they were harder to see in this area, as they were a small group of only 7 personnel, they moved toward the gas station and had been seen doing so. And as they would leave the gas station, they would be heavily mortared as they tried to return fire against this squad that had been traveling with this squad from their same platoon, and this squad that was helping to clear the homes. They would eventually move to clear this area where they had since left from and were pounded by artillery, this grouping of 12, and would move through this area and lay down fire against this grouping, who had cautiously moved gradually and then bounded into the gas station, as they would be struck by mortar fire and also L-vector of small arms fire from these 2 wedge formations of PLAN Marine troops. They would be simply annihilated in rapid fashion. As this grouping was pounded by artillery, this grouping had crossed the tributary after this had occurred, taken position along the farmhouse, with these 2 leaving the farmhouse as this grouping had first moved into this concrete shelter, storm shelter, and then they had left. They had already been seen since moving through this area as they left the headquarters property to try to escape town, but had disagreements on which path to take. There were 4 personnel hiding in the barn, trying to figure out the same thing, as command and control had disintegrated among the armed reactionary civilians, as mentioned previously, and many of them were, at this point, confused and unsure of where to go and how to handle the situation, as the leadership already after 8 a.m., had by now been thoroughly wiped out by the PLAAF airstrike with 2 1,000-pound munitions in conjunction with the Marine amphibious heavy infantry assault on the property. The remaining forces were simply nothing more than small bands of roving militiamen, and were now gradually being wiped out, as this house had been cleared with 14 defenders in it, as fire had been laid against the windows from outside, and the squad that entered had broken into two 5-man stack teams, or two half squads, and went through the house methodically, clearing out any remaining defenders. The forces of this platoon now continued their advance to clear the next house, which was empty, and to clear this now empty shelter, which again led to this squad engaging with this squad, these forces here, along with mortar support from 82mm mortar fire, as repeated mortar strikes came in, along with the small arms fire, which ended this fight here rapidly across the street from the gas station in this wooded area, which led to this squad advancing to check the gas station while this squad took position outside, according to building clearance procedures. Again, this was being well executed in a highly tactical manner, as this grouping had come out here and decided they were going to try to go north. This technical, too, had left the area, and this grouping here were now all seen out in the open and pounded by artillery and mortar strikes, as the 82mm mortars came down in multiple mortar strikes, including here, as these were areas where the mortars were striking. 122mm shell strikes came into this thinly wooded area right here on the edge of the property and across the street where this technical had pulled out. All of these forces had been slammed by the strikes, which destroyed most of this home, as the mortar strikes and the artillery strikes were just on the edges of where the house was and caused the extensive, massive damage to the area. The squad that had left the house after all this had occurred had cleared what remained of the home while the squad took position outside of it. As there had been some movement spotted outside of the barn before all 4 of these personnel could leave, as somebody was seen looking out of the barn door, 122mm strikes came in and blasted the barn away while these squads were in this position, and this squad had moved from the house to this position here. So all of this was done tactically, bounding and covering to get to the house and outside of it. This squad also had moved up here at that time, and then had moved around to check the shed before moving around the silo, which now was still barely intact after this massive shelling against the barn, and they would hold their positions here. While these 2 squads of this platoon, after checking the gas station, would bound and cover tactically toward the swampy area, but then hold their positions by this squad. So they had mutually supporting fields of fire, interlocking, mutually supporting fields of fire in a highly tactical manner. After this area was cleared, this squad would take up position in this rubbled, badly gutted home, with this squad out there to support them facing the north. As this was all going exceedingly well, as the squads in the south advanced after clearing this home with these personnel inside, these 8 personnel, they then moved into this home with this squad taking position outside of it according to buildings clearance procedures, while this squad did the same as these clearances were going on. At the same time, the squad moved up in order to watch this home. They were in a line formation with staggered weapons. This squad was in a wedge formation. They would still have interlocking fields of fire if need be, but this squad was largely focused on this home with their staggered weapons and in front of them, while the wedge was facing these 2 directions. As these 2 squads moved in to clear this home, finding it empty, and the squad took position outside of it to the south, and this squad cleared this home here, as they had somebody outside, a squad outside, they would then try to clear this home, which would lead to, as this grouping of 10 had moved into this house initially, they then would try to flee to this concrete storm shelter, which would then come under assault by this squad. After having had cleared the home, they would move into this area, as this squad moved up to support them in this operation, as they threw hand grenades into the cellar and fired small arms fire into it without exposing themselves to the door, as in leaning their weapons over and firing into it. They used their light machine gunner to fire his QBJ-201, which had an exceedingly high rate of fire, into the storm shelter after tossing in a few hand grenades, which was absolutely devastating against the forces that were now cornered and in that storm shelter. As they had now cleared the shelter, this squad had begun outside to take fire from across this creek, as this area by this business to the south of it was a somewhat swampy and also thickly wooded area, and as these forces had been relatively still upon having moved through a bit more of wooded terrain, they had in their very small groups, taken position beneath coniferous trees and were thus somewhat disguised from the massive ISR apparatus that was constantly picking targets and mapping the area in real time as the operation moved forward. As almost everything was seen, these personnel, for the time being, were a rare exception as they held extremely still in these wooded areas. Although this grouping here to the north would briefly fire at the forces in this building when they were clearing it. Fire would be returned from this house and from this squad here, and even this squad would fire into these personnel and wipe them out, because these personnel by this bridge in this thickly wooded area tried to fire at this squad and this squad, who promptly returned fire against them as a firefight ensued, and these 5 personnel moved up ahead to form a line with them and fire at the house. The two squads in the house laid down massive fire from the bottom and upper floor, and having that upper floor enabled fire down and into this area helped exceedingly well, because there were some earthen features which these personnel were trying to take cover behind. But the higher elevation provided by the top floor of the house aided in wiping these personnel out, along with all the fire from the interlocking fields of fire of all of these forces. And as one squad bounded out here after this firefight had ended, this other squad bounded out to ensure these were all KIAs and these forces, and then they bounded and covered tactically towards this creek, including this squad here that had initially helped with this house clearance. They were laying down fire against these personnel by the creek and bounded toward them, closing within grenade range, causing these remaining 3 survivors to flee the area. As they ran as fast as they could through the woods, they were now spotted by the quadcopter assets, which were constantly roving this battlefield at all times. As the quadcopters were a constant, they could see everything that moved, and in areas where there wasn't as much wooded cover from the canopy, they could see personnel in these areas as they moved through the areas. As these personnel had been under coniferous pines and had been still, they were able to lay down a somewhat quasi-successful ambush, as they had wiped out 2 PLAN Marines and caused several more wounded between all 3 of these squads that now assaulted the area together along this creek. As these personnel, numbering originally a grouping of 15, having had moved in to form a line with these personnel, had laid down heavy fire, including with these forces here that now moved up, who now laid down fire into them. These squads, with all interlocking fields of fire, had wiped out many of these personnel. Again, 3 had fled this area, and out of this original grouping of 15 that moved into the area with these personnel, only 8 would survive to flee, turn around, and try to conduct a hit-and-run attack, lay down fire. They would lose a few more personnel, with 5 left, who would then flee, and then try to turn around and take position, waiting for the PLAN Marine squads to pursue them in this action, which they surely would. As they moved across the tributary, this squad bounded and covered tactically with this squad across the tributary, taking up position along this road, while this squad and this squad, which bounded across the tributary, would take up position outside of this building, but would be laying down fire on these personnel, and these personnel who tried to initially stood their ground in the wooded area, tried to lay down fire, but this wedge formation was too much for these personnel, and massive artillery and even an airstrike was called in as these forces tried to retreat from the withering fire being laid down by the PLAN Marines. 1 of 2 of these J-10 fighter aircraft with their single pair of 1,000-pound precision laser-guided munitions would drop their 2 munitions on this fleeing group of 4, as the PLA forces, for the time being, assumed that these were slightly larger groups than what they actually were, and expended massive munitions in terms of artillery fire on the survivors of this group, which were now 5, and the survivors of this group, which were 4, hit by airstrikes, and the artillery and mortar strikes came in heavy and blew trees into dangerous flying splinters and left nothing but stumps, as the splinters turned into flying missiles, which impacted and maimed these personnel as they also were blown into pieces at the same time by the shrapnel and concussive blast waves of the striking artillery and mortars, as there was literally nothing left of these personnel due to all the artillery and mortar strikes and even the airdrop munitions. There was literally no remains of these personnel. They had been ripped to literal tiny shreds and thrown in multiple directions as pillars of smoke and wood were thrown in multiple directions as the impacting munitions exploded. As this grouping and this grouping were now thoroughly annihilated. This grouping of 3 that had been running had also been targeted by another J-10 for a prompt airstrike as they fled the battlefield, and they got no further than the edge of the map before this airstrike had come in and annihilated them in this swampy area. As these squads pursued, they would find nothing remaining of any of these groups as they combed the area for any type of remains or remaining defending personnel that miraculously survived the enormous air, artillery, and mortar strikes that now befell this area. As there had been personnel seen fleeing into this swampy area to the north of the building supply company, and a technical that was now trying to pull out of the property and was not classified as a non-combatant, as there had been combatants seen getting into it from this building. As, again, the PLA, PLAAF, PLA ground forces, which are the army, and other elements of the Chinese forces did not deliberately target civilians unless they were deemed as a threat by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which crunched all of the intelligence data and everything else, or deemed them a threat as they were seen as armed and had been seen doing suspicious actions. But these forces were known to be militia forces and thus were targeted as they fled the area. As this grouping fled north and out of the parking lot, they were promptly targeted by artillery and an airstrike that had come in by a J-10 fighter dropping its munitions. As by now, it was 9 a.m., and the fighter aircraft and the Su-34s by this point were all conducting an RTB, a return to base, as initially it had been done in phases. As the aircraft had jettisoned all their payloads, they begun to conduct their RTBs and leave the battlefield. Now, as the J-10s were expending their air-to-ground munitions, they would return, conduct any needed maintenance, also refueling, and would totally rearm with predominantly air-to-ground munitions this time instead of predominantly having air-to-air munitions. And they would only have 1 pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles as per SOP, just for self-defense, even though there was nothing left to defend against, as all American air assets had been destroyed long ago, as in hours ago. By now, as the last of the PLAAF's fighters and in other areas, the Su-34s were dropping their remaining munitions on key targets and close air support operations, the remaining assets for support would primarily, for at least a time, be the PLAN Marine 6th Brigade's Artillery Battalion of PLZ-07 122mm howitzers, and the mortar companies within the main maneuver elements of the brigade, which the medium and light and heavy combined arms battalions each had their own built-in fire support company, which was an 82mm mortar company, as the combat engineers had their own forms of support, as they had a complement of robotic and drone forces that enhanced their capabilities immensely. They, too, would be able to call upon certain assets to quell any resistance remaining on the battlefield. Now, as these forces fled into the swamps, others were trying to flee the area as well, and they would not get very far, as eventually the forces moving through this area would see them with their quadcopter assets, as well as also the high altitude and satellite assets, which all interlocked to map the area in real time, and they would be struck promptly by 122mm artillery strikes, but at a later time as they left the area. For now, however, they would survive for a short time, as this technical had fled. It had been struck heavily by 122mm shelling, as these squads would then advance to check and clear this area. The squad, having cleared this building, would move across the street, clear this building, and clear this building, while this squad would remain outside in a line position with staggered weapons to watch entry and exits of all buildings and the wooded area. While this squad, having had held position outside this building and temporarily engaged these forces here in a firefight before the massive artillery, mortar, and airstrikes would come in, would then advance to hold positions in this wooded area by the road across from these buildings as the clearance operations were going on, as this was another excellent tactical operation. These areas were thoroughly cleared as no defenders had been found, and these squads had moved deeper into this wooded area, finding nothing after this massive grouping of munitions had struck this area, causing extensive damage to the woods. As now 9:30 a.m. had rolled around, and these forces had come to their final positions in this particular area of the Vidor battle unfolding, the vehicles could now quickly move behind and catch up with their infantry forces, as they would utilize clearings in the wooded areas or take the roads to get to the end of this area, whereupon their troops would remount in their vehicles and continue on to clear other areas, which had now, with quadcopter assets from multiple companies of two different battalions, the Recon Battalion and the Medium Combined Arms Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, running circuits throughout the entire town of Vidor, the last remaining resistance that had been spotted had been confirmed to be in the big box store, which was only a mile away to the slight south and west of this area. As by now, again, as these forces moved in a uniform manner across each segment of the battle space that they had been assigned, to the south, the assault gun / light tank company had been moving at the same rate of speed, finding very light resistance in their path as most of the remaining forces again had fled into this area near the militia headquarters. And again, the rest, having had fled to the west of the advance of the assault gun / light tank company, ending up in the big box store. As the Air Assault Battalion had constantly its C-9WA attack helo gunships flying combat air patrol operations in support of their battalion's forces on the ground holding the State Highway 96 bridge area, as a flying platoon of the available two of the battalion's combat aviation company were flying from their Type 75 assault ship, which basically was a helicopter aircraft carrier, amphibious assault ship. They were flying over the area of Vidor and would have a unique opportunity to aid the fight in Vidor by contributing one of their recently refueled, fully loaded gunships to assist in the destruction of the remaining militia forces in the area, as they would essentially expend several of their HJ-08 ATGMs, which were loaded onto this gunship, as there were multiple different armament options that they could place on these gunships. This one armed with the HJ-08 ATGMs. They could also be armed with rockets of different sizes and other weapons. They also had two on each wing 23mm cannons, which were devastating against ground targets with HE armor-piercing ammunition. As they flew past this area, which, again, to the slight south and west of this map, between 9:30 and 10, would assist in the assault that would unfold against the big box store, as the southernmost platoon of this company would partake in the assault, along with the northernmost platoon of the assault gun / light tank company, contributing their 5 platoon vehicles each, plus their mounted up squads, and would have, instead of artillery assistance in this particular instance, they would have instead gunship assistance from the Air Assault Battalion's Combat Aviation Company, as they would contribute one attack helo gunship from one of 2 flying platoons. As they now rapidly, upon having rapidly moved up and remounted their troops, moved into the next area of town, the southernmost platoon of this company of ZBD-05 infantry fighting vehicles swung in as they crossed a marshy field onto this road which ran behind the big box store. They prepared to assault the remaining forces that were holed up inside of this store. So there were 35 inside of it, and others that had fled these additional areas, fleeing south and north from the assaulting medium combined arms battalion forces, as the light tank slash assault gun company, as well as the heavy marine amphibious infantry company carrying out the center of the attack, as there was another to the north and outside of the town, which was there again to catch stragglers but would find none, push their way into this area, as there were other stores in this particular large parking lot area. There were concrete islands filled with plants and other vegetation, such as grasses, and as these forces moved in, there was a small concrete wall along this road behind the store that these light tank slash assault guns would simply smash through en route to this building. And they would lay down heavy fire with their powerful 105 millimeter rifled tank guns, firing frag T shells into this building, as they opted not to use their even more destructive shells, such as their high explosive shells or heat shells. They would fire frag T shells into this building, and the platoon, the southernmost platoon of the heavy marine amphibious infantry company to the north of the assault gun slash light tank company, would fire their 30 millimeter autocannons and 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns at this building as well, as this would not only cause immense damage to this concrete structure, as it was built out of concrete cinder blocks and other concrete, and had also steel beams to reinforce its structural integrity. The massive damage of the shelling and 30 millimeter autocannon fire and plus 12.7 millimeter fire peppering this building would almost nearly raze much of it to the ground, as the last remaining technical that was a resupply vehicle for the militia had run the gauntlet of fire, because the militiaman, a single man driving the technical, had traded out his militia attire for civilian attire and had hid his weapon in the vehicle. So when the quadcopter assets were running over the area, as there were still many non-combatants left in the town, they would assume that he was a non-combatant, and he used this to run the gauntlet to try to run ammunition and other supplies to the personnel holed up in the building as he fled other areas. As these supplies had tarp over them, so there was no way the ISR assets could see the ammunition cans and other materials, he tried to run the gauntlet to get into this parking area, having had come around from another street as these forces were moving into the area. This vehicle, this light tank slash assault gun, ZBD-05, had dismounted its one squad to the north, which would climb over the concrete wall, laying down fire as they bounded in to clear the building from the back, as this squad, dismounted from the southernmost vehicle of this platoon of the heavy amphibious marine infantry company operating to the north, had deployed along the wall, laid down fire, took some fire before the heavy fire of the vehicles began to come in, and thus would do the same, bounding to cover or to clear this building. As this squad had moved into place, this squad had already since cleared this building and was now moving out from the back to avoid being fired at, and took position on this corner and was laying down fire toward the building, as this squad of militiamen and this squad had all been caught outside and were promptly mortared by 82 millimeter mortar fire from the mortar company within the medium combined arms battalion, as was this grouping here that tried to temporarily lay down fire on these forces but failed miserably, as the squad already had cleared this building and went around the corner. They then bounded to this concrete abutment and to take up positions behind it facing the building, although they also had other personnel with staggered weapons that could watch other sectors, although quadcopter assets running circuits over the area had found no more militia combatants apart from those that were now holed up in the building. As the gunship came in after these forces had already moved into place, it immediately fired its HJ-08 ATGMs, blasting these three technicals, although not at this vehicle, which flew in, and as the man got out of the vehicle, went around and untarped the supplies, The quadcopters had now seen the ammunition cans, and it was confirmed that this would be a target, so the gunship flew around to this area and laid down 23 millimeter cannon fire, blasting the truck, the ammunition, and the man into absolute pieces. As these personnel taking position here had been exchanging fire briefly before the mortar strikes, as were these. They were destroyed again by mortar fire, their vehicles annihilated by gunship fire from the Z9WA gunships firing their HJ-08 ATGMs, and the remaining militia technical with the supplies, the logistical vehicle, was annihilated and blown to multiple scraps of twisted metal from 23 millimeter cannon fire with HE-AP ammunition, high explosive armor piercing ammo. And as the personnel outside had been annihilated by mortar fire, these squads were now clear to enter and clear this building from the inside, although the layout of the building was different due to the large size of it. Most of the walls had now been blown to pieces, and most of the materials inside, as well as the shelves, had been thrown in multiple directions and in different pieces, and all the items, including food items, were all over the place and shredded into multiple pieces and scraps. These personnel had to wade through a jungle of all kinds of junk, which was effectively now what cluttered the inside of the building due to the massive 105 millimeter shelling from the light tank / assault guns combined with the powerful 30 millimeter autocannon fire. These personnel would nonetheless clear the building of any survivors from the shelling and 30 millimeter autocannon fire, and would methodically sweep the ruins and rubble and junk inside the building to clear the building out. As the gunship, now having had completed its duty of supporting this operation with remaining ammunition, would continue on with the rest of the flying platoon to conduct their patrols around the State Highway 96 bridge, wherein the two Air Assault Marine Infantry companies plus the Air Assault Mortar Company, which had been dropped off, the 82mm Mortar Company, to provide them ground-based fire support, was assisted by the Combat Aviation Company of the battalion as they did their flying patrols. And now, as the dismounted squads, one from each platoon, from each of the two companies, the Assault Gun / Light Tank Company and the Heavy Marine Amphibious Infantry Company, were finishing up clearing the building, the town of Vidor would now be thoroughly swept in the remaining sections of the town, just to ensure that there were no holdouts or hideaways where they would find any remaining lingering militia personnel. As the operation, all in all, throughout the entire Battle of Vidor, again, was a tactically brilliant masterstroke, which involved a 5-hour-long battle for this particular town in this operation. The securing of Vidor was nonetheless absolutely vital to the overall operations at hand, because, again, Vidor sat as a critical node along a key portion of I-10, which was a major chief invasion route for the external invasion components, as the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 15 through 20, of course with Group Army 15 being shed off in Houston to replace the 83rd Group Army to go to Northeast Texas, which would travel through I-10 through the entire battle space of the Beaumont / Port Arthur battle space, which included this critical node of Vidor, which sat on the Neches River I-10 bridge, as well as the node itself through which I-10 traversed, all the way to the literal and figurative gateway into the American Southeast, which was the small city of Orange. As I-10 passed through Orange and into Louisiana, this is what connected the South Central invasion sector to the Southeastern invasion sector, and Group Armies 16 through 20 would be of massive assistance to the Trojan shock forces in other areas of operation in the American southeastern invasion sector. And the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was integral in the operations to secure this vital battle space, as not only did this battle space contain several major nodes through which I-10, a massively important invasion route, traversed, it also contained many important objectives within the battle space itself that the Marines were out to secure, which included the energy facilities, the refineries, petrochemical plants, and more in the port of Port Arthur, or in the port of Beaumont. Also, the military facilities of Beaumont, which were absolutely critical, as these were effectively a major part of American national security as they deployed forces overseas from this location. The coalition forces would now use it for the same purpose, only to import and export their forces for the occupation of New China, which is what America was to be renamed, as it would be a Chinese colonial possession, as the Arctic portions of North America would go to Russia. The lower 48 and lower Canada would be Chinese colonial territory. Both areas would enhance each respective nation's not only their prestige, but their resources and more, making these nations exceedingly wealthy and also more powerful from an industrial standpoint, as there were many resources that would be extracted in these operations. As now, Vidor was wrapping up by 10 a.m. as the battle to finish off the last survivors of the militia forces holding out in the local big box store took a very short amount of time, as in a number of minutes, and the operation was literally over with. The three committed companies of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, the Light Tank / Assault Gun Company, along with the two Heavy Marine Amphibious Infantry companies, would sweep the area and ensure that there were absolutely no remaining defenders left in operation, and thus would designate the area clear, and therefore the Medium Combined Arms Battalion's forces, as in the entirety of the battalion, would move into Vidor and hold their positions in this vital node until the end of the entire campaign in this battle space, as they would sit there as a reserve force that could be committed to action at any point in any place within the overall battle space. As they also would sit in this critical node, they would ensure that the Neches River Bridge was absolutely secure, as they could be a direct heavy reinforcement that could be committed to assist the now 4 companies from the recon battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade that were holding the bridge, and the 4 additional companies were also sitting in the heart and south of Vidor, which included the 3 recon combat companies and their headquarters and support company, which were the command and logistical forces over the entirety of their battalion. The Medium Combined Arms Battalion also in town. Vidor was thoroughly secured by 10 a.m. and was also swept, again, as mentioned, after this time to ensure, again, there were no remaining holdouts of the defending forces located anywhere in this town. Even as this battle was underway, there were other concurrently unfolding battles happening throughout the battle space, which even included the operations being carried out by the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which by 7 a.m., after logistical pauses, had pushed their way into the city of Beaumont, into its port area, and were now fully engaged against American military forces, which were mainly logistical and support forces, but were also engaged against armed reactionary civilians in the area as well. Was fighting in Beaumont would be exceedingly heavy. The fighting that was also occurring concurrently in Orange had by now wrapped up even earlier than the fighting in Vidor, but the fighting in Beaumont would be the longest lasting of this operation, with the exception of the cleansing of the hinterlands to the general north of the battle space, which would occur on the second day of the invasion. But for now, fighting in Beaumont was heavy, as by 7 a.m. in the port area, both the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion were arriving on scene to engage in battle. 85 miles to the general west-south of the city of Beaumont, or slight southwest, the forces of the Trojan shock armies, which were the 36th PAP Brigade, as well as also the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, were fighting hard to secure their critical key nodes in this particular operation, as capturing the entire Houston metro area was a massive task which required massive forces, such as the large PLA's 83rd Group Army, the 36th PAP Brigade from the paramilitary fanatical People's Armed Police, which were crack elite forces of China in the paramilitary sense, as they fought fanatically and were exceedingly loyal to Xi and the party. These forces were joined in this operation by the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade, which was a brother unit of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, which had landed in the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, as the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade had landed in the Texas City, Texas area, and had a number of key objectives, after which it was pursuant. As the Houston battle space for the external invasion prong came before the Beaumont and Port Arthur battle space for the 15th through 20th Group Armies, they would have to pass through the Houston battle space first en route to the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, after which they would move on into the American Southeast, as there were somewhat strong, in terms of their equipment, American military forces present in the Houston battle space. These forces would need to be and were being subdued rapidly, as massive concentrations of firepower from some of the latest and greatest equipment of the PLA, plus the fanatical, extremely well-trained fighting forces of the People's Armed Police, and even throwing in the PLAN Marines, would fight exceptionally hard to annihilate all American defending military and even paramilitary forces, as well as armed reactionary civilians, which among defending forces were generally of the lowest priority, as they made the smallest impact, unless, of course, we were describing actual well-organized militia forces. And although there were American militia forces sprinkled all throughout the nation, these forces varied in terms of their quality, organization, logistical capabilities, and weaponry and equipment, as some militias were far better equipped, trained, and logistically prepared than were others. But against the raw might of the iron grip of the PLA and their coalition's ISR apparatus, as well as their AI capabilities, IT capabilities, communications, and sheer firepower advantage, the Americans could do very little against such forces, as the technology gap was simply of a massive scale, as the coalition forces had weaponry that the Americans could never dream of, or just simply didn't have at all. and other weapons as well that the Americans might have had, but had in too few of a quantity to make much of a difference, and couldn't deploy effectively due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and the enormous use of electronic warfare jamming across the battle space. The anti-satellite cyber strikes and electronic warfare made such a massive impact on the invasion that the Americans were incapable of putting up any serious major resistance whatsoever at all, as the inability to communicate meant that you had no ability to coordinate or organize your forces and keep them that way. It also meant that very rapidly, unless forces bunched together, forces would break apart and lose communications with one another, and therefore be essentially useless in combat operations, as they would quickly be isolated and destroyed and could not work together in their intended force structure. As the fighting all over the South Central and other invasion sectors was immensely heavy at this time on day one. Day one was truly the make it or break it day of the operation. This was the day that determined the fate of the nation, as follow-up days would simply be for mopping up all remaining resistance, as truly by the 48-hour mark, virtually all American forces by then will have been completely and totally destroyed, or at the very least broken up in very tiny pockets that were somehow still holding out that would be rapidly mopped up. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the battle in Beaumont itself will be explored, as the Combat Engineer Battalion, along with the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, had begun their sweep into the city to capture massively important objectives that lay therein. More to come in the next video.